Thank you again to the four of you very much for your time and for your expertise. It's very much appreciated. And my students and I prescripted 3 questions that we wanted to ask the panelists. First, I'd love it if you wouldn't mind doing a brief introduction of who you are and the organization you represent. Basically just a elevator speech. And then what we'll do is I have my questions here that I already had sent to the four of you. And then after we get through those, we would love to have any questions from those of you still here, still in attendance, if you have them. So Julie, would you care to begin? And please make sure that you pass the handheld mic to each person when you speak.
Thanks for inviting me to be a part of this discussion. My name's Julie Boardman. I'm with Redtail Land Conservancy, and we are a land trust located in East Central Indiana, and we preserve, protect, and restore natural areas. A lot of those areas are along waterways and watersheds.
My name's Jason Donetti. I work for the Stormwater Management Department in the Muncie Sanitary District. My title is Stormwater Educator and Recycling Educator. And I just want to say great job on the documentary. It was incredible. And the website's incredible as well. So it's an honor to be here.
Good evening. I'm Julie Harold I work with the Division of Soil Conservation in the Indiana State Department of Agriculture. I am the Program Manager for Water Quality Initiatives.
Hello, my name is Colby Gray. I work locally for a firm called Flatland Resources, and in my role as an urban environmental planner, I work a lot with the Delaware County Soil and Water Conservation District, who's been a partner with this project over the years. So, also honored to be here, and also wanted to say a great job on the documentary.
And it's worthwhile to note that Colby, as he mentioned, he's been our community partner since the very beginning, since before Water Quality Indiana became a thing. So we're grateful to his partnership and hope that it continues. So the first question my students and I wanted to know from the four of you is, what did you learn from what you just saw in the documentary?
Should I go first?
Sure, you got the mic.
You know, I get the privilege of talking with a lot of the people that are featured in the video on a daily basis, especially represented in the agricultural community. But, and Michael, I think was here, might have left already. But one of the things that I appreciated that the documentary was able to do is connect me to the people that share that experience of living in the Gulf of Mexico. Okay, so you know, I've seen that hypoxia zone map 1,000 times in my life, but I don't think I'll ever look at it the same. Okay, and just hearing the story coming from the mouth of that fisherman, you know, I think it helped me understand like what some of those economic impacts are. Like, okay, fuel costs. You have to travel further to get to the area where there's a higher level of oxygen to harvest. You know, so it's just those kind of like putting those pieces together and how much well just seeing faces and hearing people speak, this kind of brings a greater understanding. So it wasn't, you know, just like enhancing that understanding.
For me, working in the water quality world day to day, week by week, a lot of the issues that were shown in this video I deal with on a day-to-day basis, week-to-week basis. But it was nice to see the perspective from other people outside of the kind of work that I do. So I enjoyed listening to that kind of perspective.
I mainly work in the urban environment, so that's where a lot of my experience and work is done within city limits and whatnot. So it was great to hear from people working in the rural areas, and it really drove home that point that I try to use when educating kids if I visit a school and things like that, is that we're all connected, and the watersheds are connected, and what we do here affects, you know, people downstream. I also appreciated hearing Michael say, you know, talk about relationship building, and I think it's very easy for a lot of us to have our own personal bias and have our own feelings and thoughts about specific issues, and we're passionate about them. But I think there's something to say when a documentary or something of this nature really helps you understand each person's story, and it allows you to empathize with what they're dealing with, whether it's the fishermen or the Farm Bureau, or someone who's been studying it for years and years. So I really appreciated that and learned a lot from that.
Well, I kind of like numbers and facts and figures, and I was really, I think the thing that stood out first to me was the fact that, yay, Indiana's second in cover crops, because it just always seems like Indiana's at the bottom almost every list statistically that we see, so I was like, yay. But of course then the chilling fact that it's 9%. So, statistics can be so misleading. So that really stood out in my mind. I was excited about that. And then I would kind of echo some of the things, just, seeing faces, because it's easy, I think, to sit there and think, especially when you hear the people in the Gulf say it's a nitrogen phosphorus problem. And so you think, agriculture, farmers, but when you hear the farmer speak of, he doesn't want to lose his nitrogen because that's money out of his pocket, and he cares about the land, that a lot of this, land's been in people's families for years, and they care about it, and they want to take care of it. And it's the community they live in, so it's not some huge mega corporation that's, destroying the environment. These are people who live here, so I think seeing those faces and hearing those voices, was important, because it's too easy to just label things as it's agriculture or it's this or it's that. And then I think the last thing that really stood out to me was the gentleman from Farm Bureau saying that legislation isn't what's needed right now. And I thought to myself, I wonder what the people in the Gulf would say, whether or not they think, legislation might help. Because I completely understand we don't want more rules and regulations and maybe putting money into having people go out and test the water and identify who's a culprit isn't a solution. But I thought, I wonder what the people in the Gulf would say, whether or not we need more regulation in the Midwest, where a lot of the nutrients are coming from. So.
Thank you for that. And the second question is actually a great segue, Julie, to what you said. It's actually two parts, so I'm going to break a journalistic rule here and give you a two-part question. Cover crops came up a lot in our interviews, and so we made an editorial judgment call to look in greater detail at cover crops. But besides that, what do you think are viable solutions to address excess nutrients in our watersheds? And then, to your knowledge, where are we in the process of enacting these solutions?
Well, coming from a land conservation background, obviously, my answer might be slightly biased by what I'm most knowledgeable about. But they mentioned in the film about buffers, and I just think, buffers are huge. If you are any kind of a science environmental background, you've heard the phrase that wetlands are the environment's kidneys. They filter things out. And, back in the day, before civilization, and agriculture and everything took over in Indiana, we had 25% of our total coverage was wetlands. And now we're at about 4%. And there are lots and lots of programs, and I'm sure, Julie, you can speak more to this, through the Department of Agriculture and other places to help farmers reinstitute wetlands on their properties and to increase buffer zones and to plant native species and things that not only prevent nutrient runoff, but are also, habitat building for wildlife and a lot of other positive things that can happen. So to me, anytime you can have a solution that addresses a lot of problems like carbon sequestration and other things, I like those kinds of solutions, and it's beautiful, it's community enhancing. So I'm just going to tackle that one since that's more from my background. But sort of the second part of your question, which was maybe what's already been happening. So there are some really exciting changes that are happening. I know I was in southwestern Delaware County and saw a farmer who has taken out of production some low land. It's so easy to see when you're driving around this time of year and you see the really dark, rich black soil, and that's hygroscopic soil that was a wetland or is wetland type soils. And to see farmers where they know it's marginally productive land to take that out of production, many times with the use of some of the programs that are available to restore wetlands and to put in native species and things. It's just really exciting to see in our community. And on a bigger scale, there's a program called the Healthy Rivers Initiative, which was enacted in about 2010. It's mainly targeted at the Wabash River watershed, but several organizations have come together and they've actually purchased about 94 miles of riverfront land that is put into permanent conservation. So to me, that's pretty exciting. Their goal is to protect about 70,000 acres, and they're about halfway there. And that's a really exciting partnership between several programs, and it's land that will be permanently protected. And then I guess on the last segment of that question is the work that we do at Red Tail, which is to preserve and protect land here in East Central Indiana. And three of our top priorities are the White River watershed, the Mississinewa Water Rivershed, and the Little Blue River down through Henry County. And we tallied up prior to coming here tonight, and we've estimated about 10 miles of riverfront that we've protected either through watershed areas like Buck Creek or Bush Creek, as well as the rivers themselves. So trying to permanently protect land along the rivers and the watersheds to act as buffer zones.
I certainly think cover crops are great and serving a great purpose, and it's good to hear that more and more people are using them, and farmers are more and more open to them, and they understand the importance of them. So I think that is a great strategy moving forward as far as helping address some of these issues. Again, I speak more from kind of an urban experience, and so when we think about protecting water quality, we think about utilizing best management practices, and I spend a great deal of time educating people about installing rain gardens, installing rain barrels, and doing things like that to capture water and prevent water from picking up pollutants on its way to the storm drain. I mainly do a lot of education, and I think education is key. Getting into schools, working with different groups, and collaborating with these different organizations that are doing lots of great things is super important, and staying in good communication with all these organizations. What more can be done? I think more enforcement possibly in rural areas. I think you brought up a great point about the Gulf. People living in the Gulf probably have a different opinion about what can be done legislatively, laws that can be introduced. I know that we partnered with a group in Indianapolis, the White River Alliance, and we did some phosphorus-free fertilizer campaigning to try to encourage people as consumers when they go to a store to buy fertilizer to try to purchase phosphorus-free fertilizer, which has had some significant impacts, and some states have actually I think ban phosphorus in fertilizer, so you're starting to see more companies do that. And then I think something that we can do better, and is one of our goals, is working with landscape companies and how they apply things. Again, I'm talking on a much smaller scale compared to farming and acreage, but how landscapers apply fertilizer, what time of year they do it, how they apply it, what are the best management practices. Those types of things are pretty important things that we're working on. And then lastly, we're separating our combined sewers. There was a small point made, there's some cheers in the audience. There was a small, you're not cheering about the construction, are you? But there was some small points made in the film about that, and these older cities, including Muncie, we have such an old infrastructure that the Muncie Sanitary District is adamantly trying to eliminate combined sewer overflows and working hard. And so when you're in that traffic stop and seeing all of that construction, that's a lot of what's going on, and it's very important. So.
Excuse me, sorry, I'm trying to prevent from getting a cold here. Cover crops were definitely mentioned a lot in the video. Cover crops are a great practice. It has on a number of aspects and what it can do for the ground. The soil health, the main thing that we talk about within the agency that I work with and the partners, other conservation partners that we work with, cover crops not only help with controlling nitrogen and keeping that nitrogen on the ground, but they help with improving soil health, they help with water infiltration. They actually, and during the time of the year, as the video pointed out, when crops are not being grown, the cover crops on the ground, what they do is they allow the nitrogen that is still in the soil that was not used by the crops, it holds that nitrogen so it can be used the following year. So in addition to cover crops, there are a lot of other practices that can be done. The video does mention some of those, and Julie mentioned some of them as well. Buffer practices, filter strips along bodies of water are very good. In my line of work, we tend to, even though buffers are very good practices, we tend to think of them as a diaper practice. And what I mean by that is, yes, they are a very good practice. They can stop a lot of pollutant runoff, but we need to be doing more in the field before it gets to the buffer practice. And things that we can do are the wetlands, our tree plantings in floodplain areas, doing no-till on the ground where the farmer does not go out and plow up his field. Keeps the soil covered, it helps keep the soil in place. There's a lot of nutrient management practices that can be done by a farmer. We have several programs within our conservation partnership that can help with many of these practices. One of them in particular that we have within our Department of Ag is called Infield Advantage. And it is a program where currently we have worked with over 70,000 acres in the state. We've worked with a number of farmers in helping them be able to know what kind of fertilizer, or how much nitrogen fertilizer they're putting on their ground, knowing whether or not it's the correct rate, if it's too much, if it's not if it's too much, if it's not enough. It's a program that has been going on since 2010. We started out in a pilot project in one county, and we're now, I believe, about half of the state is covered in that program. So I feel like just in the short amount of time that program has been available, that we're seeing a good increase in that. Excuse me. Also, when I mentioned the Indiana Conservation Partnership, all the partners that we work with there are 8 agencies within that partnership in the state of Indiana. One of those is the Natural Resource Conservation Service, which we refer to as NRCS. There are a lot of federal programs through that agency, as well as the Farm Service Agency is a federal government agency that also has a lot of conservation programs. Those programs allow landowners to receive cost share to help install practices, so that they are so that they are more willing to put conservation practices on the ground. It gives them incentives and cost share to help install practices. I'm trying to think the next part of your question. What we are doing in the state of Indiana is working with these landowners on a voluntary basis. The agency I work for is not a regulatory agency. We are here to help the farmer and help the landowner to want to do things because it's the right thing to do. To have good stewardship, to want to be able to pass his farm on to the next generation in the best condition that he can. There is a lot of work going on as far as the amount of partnerships, not just within our state, but within the whole Mississippi Basin. There is a task force that's called the Hypoxia Task Force. I had the privilege of going down to New Orleans actually last week, same area that you guys were in. Actually met with some of the people that were in the video, so it was neat to be able to speak with them last week and then see them in the video and just hear the different perspectives. But this task force is a task force that's made up of the 12 major states that drain to the Gulf of Mexico, as well as several different federal agencies, including EPA, USGS, NOAA. So it is a task force that we've worked together for, I believe the task force was put together in the late 90s. There's been a lot of work, a lot of cooperation that has needed to form within this task force. But we are moving forward. We have a lot of important projects that we're working on to help with the issue of hypoxia and with the issues in Indiana, the solutions that we need within Indiana and within all of the states in the Mississippi River Basin. I'll pass it on to you now.
It's a pleasure going last on this question, because there's obviously so much ground has been covered and everybody speaks really specifically. I did want to mention one thing that Julie mentioned about the Infield Advantage program. I think that program is, we adopted it pretty early here in Delaware County, and I think that it's a really great resource for farmers, as was mentioned many times in the video. Sometimes it isn't a one-size-fits-all type solution because of the fact that even in our own watersheds in our own backyards, fields can vary so much in terms of soils and the proximity to the floodplain and geography, and even things like glacial patterns that affect the landscape. And so what the infield advantage does is it actually creates data points within the field itself where farmers can collect and analyze nitrogen uptake data in corn stalks. Okay? And if you kind of interpolate that information, you kind of get a sense of how much, if there was excess nitrogen that was applied to the fields and where those areas are highly concentrated or where they're located. Okay? And so, as the technology develops then, and you get that feedback loop on a farm-by-farm basis, theoretically, as they're going side dressing those fields, with a combination of GPS and variable rates, they can actually only apply nitrogen where it's absolutely necessary. Okay, so that's encouraging, and it's encouraging that the local farmers in Delaware County adopted that so quickly, and I think their eyes are being opened. At the same time, I think it was mentioned a lot of times as well, one of the things we discovered is that there wasn't a whole lot of excess nitrogen in the corn stalks themselves, which just sparked just a lot of questions about, have we really created a system that we're kind of dependent on these nutrients, and so what do we do? And I think that was one of the questions that the documentary captured so well, because there's a lot of people who realize something that needs to be done, and was humble to the great challenge. So unrelated to those things, but also kind of a best management practices I think that would be helpful for us is also, and I don't know if this is part of the task force or what, but Indiana doesn't currently have a water quality standard for nitrogen, as I understand. And the guidance and recommendations that they give are pretty extreme. So, there's certain sources that reference that it should be 1 milligrams per liter in our waterways, and on the opposite end of the extreme, it shows 10 milligrams per liter in our waterways. And without getting into a lot of chemistry, that's quite a range. Okay? And currently the average that we've looked at with the historical data going back with the Bureau of Water Quality is a lot of time, both in the White River, Mississippi, and other areas of rivers in the state, we're looking at a historical average around 3 milligrams per liter, and that's on an average of high flow events and low flow events. Okay, so if we use 10 milligrams per liter as our target, then there really is we're amazing. You know what I mean? And so that sends a different message.
Great.
To producers, and to the citizens at large that are trying to understand all this stuff. IDEM just recently did a more in-depth study in the Mississippi River in Delaware County, and because of that standard, that target being selected at 10, there really wasn't any marching orders for us to try to take action because that was a low priority issue. Okay. Compounding that, a lot of our biologists through the various agencies sample our streams, rivers, and they see that the results of the aquatic life, fish, macrovertebrates, are fair, in many instances good, which scratches your head, and it just goes to show the importance of drawing these connections to these broader issues, because nitrogen, as is mentioned, is water soluble, and it takes off really quick, and it doesn't have a whole lot of time to cause problems in our own backyard, so we don't see those issues. So I think long story short, having a better sense of what we're going for in terms of a target, I think would help put a lot of things in perspective. And for instance, if 3 milligrams per liter has been the average since the 1960s, and this hypoxia zone seems to be growing, well, that seems to suggest we need something a little bit less than 3 in order to scale back the growth of that dead zone or reverse it.
So that question was more on a macro level, so state and regional initiatives. All right, one more question and then we open the floor to everybody in the room. But speaking of everybody in the room, there's about 40 to 50 people here. So I'm looking for one strategy or tip or suggestion you have of what the average general person who doesn't work in a scientific field, what can they do to sustain water quality, to improve it, in your estimation? One tip. We're also interested then, how do you motivate people to do these tips and strategies that you suggest? Because I think that's the bigger issue. You can list and identify strategies, tips, suggestions for improved water quality. How do you motivate people to affect change? That's the other part.
One of my favorite scenes in the documentary was that pan that they had of, it showed products, all the products that had high fructose corn syrup in it. And I don't know which one of you is responsible for that. And you know, it just, I think it kind of made us realize that there's a tendency to point at agriculture or point at sanitary systems and point out those problems, but sometimes it's our consumer behavior that is built this system, you know. And so I think just one tip, you know, obviously we have to think about what we're consuming and why, and if we're contributing, you know, through these choices to a system that is so dependent on nitrogen. Okay? And the other thing in terms of motivating people, I mean, that's a tougher challenge, but I do know that there's going to be a lot of tips and stuff that's given, but I encourage everyone to make a commitment, and I know many of you already, to get yourself out on a canoe, okay? Get on the White River, get on this one, go out to Prairie Creek Reservoir, walk the new trails out there, and appreciate what we have. Because once you get down in that river and you kind of lose sight of what's going on around you, you're in a magical place in a different place. And I think frequent exposure to that will develop a sense of ownership, and I mean, maybe even a love and appreciation for it. And I think if you can cultivate that in the youth or in individuals, if you value something, you're gonna find the tips, and they're gonna be rooted deeper, you know. So that's a two-part thing.
In terms of water quality, I think it's important that we all understand that what we do on a day-to-day basis has an impact on that water quality, whether it's coming from our own yards, our roofs, our driveways, even our neighborhood streets that we live in. Anything that we put on our lawns will or may eventually drain, if we live in an urban area, will eventually drain to the storm sewer systems. That goes to a local stormwater treatment center, and then that water is treated by the tax dollars coming in. So the more that we can do to understand what we do on a day-to-day basis to help the water quality even in our own neighborhoods will help to make the cost of trying to treat the water even easier to deal with. As far as pointing to one thing that we can do, that's a tough thing, because I think it depends on your background, your perspective on what you think is important. I mean, there's little things such as picking up your pet waste. I mean, there's responsible car washing. There's when you're putting fertilizer on your own lawns, looking at the labels. There's a lot of just little things that can add up on a day-to-day basis that are important. And I don't think that we all think of that kind of, you know, they may seem like small things, but they add up. And I don't think that, you know, I know even I don't pick up after my pet all the time, but I should. So that's just some of the things I wanted to say that I don't think we think about enough.
I guess I have a simple tip, and it's kind of a pet peeve as well. Sweep up your grass clippings. You know, again, I'm coming from an urban standpoint, so there's nothing that bothers me more than driving down a residential street and a guy with the headphones is just blowing all the grass clippings into the street, and they never get swept up. That's nutrients, and they belong back in your yard or in a compost bin, or if you have to, you can throw them away for free in your toter if you bag them. that's something that I would recommend that you think about or encourage your friendly neighbor to consider. And then the complex tip I would have is get involved in government and even politics, I would say, because legislatively there's lots of interesting things happening state and nationally and locally. And I just think about how there's not enough people involved and things are getting passed. How many of us went to vote recently in November and saw a referendum that didn't even know anything about? And did we look into what the referendum was about? But we read this paragraph and had to make a pretty serious decision. And I just don't see a lot of people getting involved as much as I would like to see. And then, the motivation of that is encouraging young people to be a part of that process. Let's stop leaving young people out of that process and thinking that they're going to learn it on their own, because they're not going to. We need to lead them and bring them to the table so they're a part of this process, and that we're continuing to collaborate and work together and pay attention and make good decisions and float in the river, like Colby said.
I really loved, I think it was maybe right at the closing credits, there was a line about everything is connected. And I don't know who wrote that or who put that in there, but that's like usually my mantra. Every time I'm trying to speak to a group to motivate them to do something, is that we are all connected. All of our actions are connected. So whether it's the grass clippings or the pet waste, or maybe you own land and have a farm, everything is connected. So it doesn't matter what you do, you just need to do something. And we do all have a voice that we can use. That we're all constituents. We can vote with our dollar, we can vote with our pocketbook, whether it's products and choosing what we purchase. Just know that you have power and you can do something. Everybody can do something. And so the big key is just to pick what your low-hanging fruit is and start there, and then make it a priority in your life to do something. And the other thing I did like about the movie that I want to share is that it's hopeful. I know that that it grows, but it is hopeful. And for people who are a little bit older than maybe, since I'm one of the older ones on the panel, if you know anything about what the White River looked like back in the 70s, if anybody has ever heard John Craddock give his talk, I mean, you want to talk about the hypoxia zone. It was running right through our city. And what they were able to accomplish through the Water Quality Bureau, and at least from my understanding, it wasn't by levying huge fines or anything like that. It was through education and also, testing, obviously. But it was through education and working as partners to try and fix the problem. So I think if we can fix the problems that were occurring back in the 70s, when Muncie was actually advertised as having this great sewer, which was the White River, that would flush all of your toxic things that your plant that you brought to town would have. So I just think it's really hopeful if we look at the past and where we've been, and I think it's a similar type of problem that we can all contribute to, and that we can fix it. We just need to really work. And as well as there's lots and lots of programs financially that can support growers and producers. It's not like there isn't a solution out there. It's out there. We just need to get people educated and motivated to make a difference.
Thank you. We'll take questions, please, but if you don't mind, I do want to thank our panelists for their time. Do we have any? Kelly, can one of you bring the mic to her, please?
It's hard for me to narrow down questions because I'm all fired up after watching this. But thank you to the students for a beautiful job, and thank you to the four of you, especially for being here this evening to share your perspectives. And I would, love to talk more and to the wee hours of the morning about what you think about the lack of discussion about diversification options here, and how that we really weren't even able to delve completely into that issue in this documentary. And what we think about the Farm Bureau saying, well, since we grow corn and soybeans well here, we should just keep on doing it because we can do it as well as anyone else, rather than looking at the reasons why we're growing those crops and maybe thinking about different alternatives to that. But I'm really interested in, maybe Julie and Colby, you can speak to this, how people are taking advantage of the programs that are offered when it comes to the resources that we have for buffers and other types of solutions to this? Are they being utilized well? If not, why aren't they? Is it a lack of education? Other constraints that the farmers have that we're not necessarily aware of? And I guess in relation to this documentary, is there a way that we can use this documentary to educate people, or how can we use this as a tool now that we have this available, not just for the people that are here in the room this evening, but is there a way that we can get the word out through this documentary or related conversations to help encourage people to take advantage of these kinds of programs so that we're dealing with the problems more effectively?
Okay, the work that's being done out in the field, we do have, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of financial incentives and cost share available. It is being used. It depends. There's a lot of factors that determines how well that's used on a year-by-year basis. I can tell you with one of the programs we have called the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program. It is an enhancement of the Conservation Reserve Program, CRP, that's been around for many years through Farm Service Agency. The CREP program is an enhancement of that, and it is a program that offers, FSA, Farm Service Agency, offers incentives and cost share to landowners for putting practices in, and the state of Indiana also gives dollars for practices that are put in. This year alone, we have had over 2,700 acres that have been enrolled into the program. It doesn't sound like a lot when you compare that to the whole state of Indiana, but it is a program that is only centered in 11 watersheds in the state of Indiana, and those 11 watersheds were chosen based off of water quality monitoring data and resource assessments and things that were done through those, through water quality data, that kind of thing. So it doesn't sound like a large acreage, but when you compare it to where we've been before with that particular program, we have seen just in the last year a 10% increase. Other programs, federal Farm Bill programs like EQIP, which stands for Environmental Quality Incentive Program. When you work for the government, you learn to use a lot of acronyms, so I apologize for that. But that particular program, it gives landowners millions of dollars to be able to put in practices for animal waste storage facilities, putting in no-till, putting in cover crops. There's millions of dollars that are spent every year in the state of Indiana in that particular program alone. I don't have those exact figures, but I can tell you it's in the millions. So, is that information you were looking for?
We're just making,
Okay.
wondering if everyone was taking advantage of what was available, or if there were still resources that people were not tapping into because they had their own limitations or
Okay, yes,
constraints.
the resources that are available, they're definitely taking advantage of it, and actually, we don't have enough resources for the farmers to take advantage of. And that can be both staff resources. We just don't have enough boots on the ground to be able to be out there to talk to those landowners. And we do, like I said, have a lot of funds, but there's just not enough. So we could use more. So.
I'd just like to kind of talk to that issue as well, just for some context. And a lot of these grant funds, they're you kind of think of them in two different categories. One is, well, on all of them, they're competitive, right? So there's a limited amount of funds.
Yeah, it's voluntary but competitive.
Yeah, there's a limited amount of funds, and of course, a lot of people around the state. So each county or region has to kind of get organized to try to get some of those funds that come to our region. Okay. So sometimes there can be, because of that, there can you can imagine there's seasons where you don't get funding and it goes to elsewhere in the state, and then some people who are planning for that or hoping for that can kind of get discouraged and drop off of actively pursuing some of those dollars. There's other challenges where you have a lot of interest and you only get a portion of what you requested. Sometimes there's some, and this is speaking to the challenges, you know. Sometimes the funds get released in 2015, or get awarded in 2015, but don't get released to 2016, so there's these delays, you know, and it's just, there's a lot of issues that kind of can contribute to, you know, discouragement or funding's not coming to like our region, if that makes sense. The good news is that here recently in the last few years, we've been pretty active in trying to get out and get drum up interest in the cost share program and let everyone know that we're getting organized, that we want to make some group requests. And we've had a lot of good feedback from direct mailings that we've done to targeted landowners, to producers, and we got a pretty good list of folks that are ready that want to do these practices and are aware of them, we've built relationships with them. And I think that's paid off in the sense that two major funding sources, which is Clean Water Indiana and the IDEM Section 319 program, have both awarded and combined totals close to $300,000 to be used over the next 3 or 4 years for people who are locally interested. So we've secured a lot of that funding, and now it's just a matter of trying to get it implemented, and that'll be something that goes on. But I did want to just talk about what that means, though, because now we're not economists or anything in our watershed planning, but it kind of goes back to that. Well, what's the target, and how much do we need to reduce? Okay, and if we utilize if we utilize our target in our modeling, trying to figure out how much tons of, say, nitrogen per acre per year we need to reduce, that can translate to these best management practices. So we can also say how much does a filter strip actually pull out of that contribution. Okay? And then we can assign price values to the costs of those filter strips and other types of practices. Right? And so just some really quick ballpark numbers. I'm being recorded, but don't quote me. It just, that's the idea of that, that if you utilize these practices and kind of interpolate how much can they actually get per year, and how much would we need on the ground in order to capture all that excess nitrogen. We found out in a sub-watershed area that was, the upper Mississippi, that was 2 or 3 counties combined, it would cost close to $42 million just to deal with the nitrogen issue. It's probably going to be more than that. And so if we're talking about putting in 2 or 3 year efforts to get $300,000, that represents a very small portion of what needs to be done. And it's really not the government's job to pay for everyone to do these things. And it's not sustainable financially for us to expect that us, the citizens, to pay for this. So I think the key thing is how do we use the dollars that we do have strategically, address areas that are legitimately have great need, but more importantly, utilize those as demonstration projects for private sector adoption. And I think videos like this, are good ways to get the message out, and then be able to say, okay, well, here's the dollars that we have available, and please take advantage of the programs that we have. So.
Can I add something to that? To add what he's talking about, one of the things that we are doing within the State Department of Ag and within the whole Conservation Partnership is we have begun since 2013 to capture the nutrient load reductions from all the conservation BMPs that we are assisting a landowner to put on the ground. And when I say assisted, that's all the practices where we are giving them cost share or incentives to put on the ground. We use the nutrient load reduction model known as the Region 5 model. It was developed by EPA, so therefore is approved by EPA, which is a good thing that we're using something approved by them. But it's a model that captures nutrient load reductions of sediment, nitrogen, and phosphorus. It will tell us, depending on the practices being put on the ground, how much reductions there are of sediment, nitrogen, phosphorus from that practice itself. It takes a lot of data gathering, a lot of time investment in determining those nutrient load reductions, but we have found it to be very, very valuable. We are the only state within the United States that is doing this kind of work with a nutrient load reduction model. We are using the information to look at statewide where we where more dollars are focused for conservation and where we might need to focus more dollars for conservation. We use a colored map basically that will, the darker the color, the more dollars are being put in that area because more nutrient load reductions are coming from those practices. So it's a resource for us to be able to know where we need more staff and more dollars.
All right, so I think I'm going to wrap it now, at least for the recording. But if you do have questions for the students, for me, for our professionals, we have the room until 9 o'clock. We would welcome your comments, your questions. Otherwise, thanks for your support and drive safely.